So, Margot's World of Buttons. There's lots of different types of buttons, aren't there? There's some beautiful shaped buttons, there's 4 holes, there's 2 holes, there's, oh look, we've got air vents in this one. We have shanked buttons, pattern on one side, and a little shank on the other side. There's different types of shank buttons. This one's got a gold loop, a coat or something like that. This one looks like a button on a button with a shank underneath. You can see the hole stitched through. There's buttons that were originally made out of tortoiseshell, poor tortoise. I'm hoping that that doesn't happen anymore. Some have uneven surfaces. It's another type of shank. Sometimes buttons come in tubes like this. And it's great to be able to sew on a button. How many times have you been asked to sew on a button? So here we go. We're using an embroidery needle or a crewel needle, and we're going to load up our thread, try and find matching thread colour to your button or matching thread colour to your garment. It's up to you. We need to thread the needle, and we need about 1/2 metre of threaded needle or thereabouts when it's on the double. We need to run our hands down the thread once you've threaded the needle, just to get rid of all the twists or loops when the thread comes off the cone or off the spool. You don't want to get a knot in your thread before you've even started threading the needle. Then we're tying a knot in the end. 1 or 2 knots is good. If you can get the knot on top of each other, that's great. Sometimes it takes a bit of practice. Then trim off the excess thread. Leave a couple of mils there. If you trim too close to the knot's going to come undone. And we need that knot to hold onto the fabric. You can use chalk to mark a point where you're going to start sewing your button. It's always a good idea to chalk a mark so you know where you're heading. I'm just doing this piece of fabric for an example for you today. And we're going to just do 2 or 3 stitches so that that thread is firmly attached to our fabric and our button is not going to shift in the slightest once it's actually sewn on. Doing 2 or 3 stitches. Got our button. We thread it through the holes. We're going across today. And then we go to the underneath side. And then we go across. It's easier to work on the top side of your fabric rather than going down into the fabric and underneath and then back up to the top. And up and down. Check that you're going across in and out of the right holes. And we want to do at least 2 or 3 stitches through each of those holes. So when you've got a 4-hole needle, you need to do double the amount of stitching. If you've just got a 2-hole button, I should say, or a 4-hole button. If you've got a 2-hole button, then you just need to do 3 stitches through those 2 holes. And invariably you get knots as you go. So you've just got to be very patient. Pull it out, don't pull it through, pull it back out with your fingers, untwist it and then try and pull it through. Sometimes you have to pull one thread through and then the other thread. And there we go, it's all pulled through, and then just flatten out your thread so there's no more twists in your thread as you go. And we keep going on both sides to get our 3 stitches. Try and keep those stitches neat to the top of your fabric. Then you're not going in and out of your garment or your whatever it is that you're sewing the button onto. Okay. You can use thimbles if you want to on your fingers underneath and on your finger that's actually stitching the needle. Some people like to use thimbles on the fingers to the underneath side so that you're not going to stab yourself. This here I'm winding it around 3 times around your threads of your button so that that actually sits the button up above the fabric so that it can go through the buttonhole and sits up a little bit above the fabric, and you know it's firmly attached to your fabric. Then we just do 1, 2 or 3 stitches through at the end, which means that that button is going to be firmly attached. In that last loop, thread it back through itself and then it knots itself. Keep all those stitches underneath the button and then no one can see your hand sewing outside. There it is. You can see the inside is nice and neat because we've barely even used it, and underneath all those stitches are looped in together. Now trim off the excess, once again not too close to the end, leave a few mils, and then we have our beautiful button sewn onto our garment. And as I said before, you can go across on a diagonal with your stitches instead of going the top layer and the bottom layer. You can go left to right and right to left and have a X marks the spot if you like. Up to you, you're the designer. So shank buttons are much the same. We start with a needle and thread, as we did before, put a knot in the end, trim it off. There's our shank button. There's the hole, and that's how we're going to attach it to our pocket that we have here. Going to put it in the middle. We do the starting thread and pull it through and do 2 stitches on top of each other, which holds our thread onto the fabric to establish a base for where our button's going to go. A little twist here in the thread. I'm just establishing that it's not knotted up. If you're ever trying to hurry sewing on a button, this usually happens. Let's get those knots and twists out of our thread and continue on. So it's almost exactly the same as a normal 2-hole or a 4-hole button. It's just the shank is a slightly different way of attaching it. So we go through the shank, in and out of the shank. You just have to hold it slightly different to your fabric. It's easier to fold it over and have your finger underneath so that you can see where you're stitching the threads onto and the shank at the same time. So we need to go through the thread. You're just catching sort of 2, 3, 4 mils of thread, 2, 3, 4 millimetres of fabric, so that that button is going to be attached. Okay, if you're only getting like a millimetre of fabric, it's not going to be a firm attachment. So keep going. We need to do our 2 stitches, 2 or 3 stitches through the shank, the same as we're doing any other button, and attaching it to our underneath fabric. So we make sure to do the 2 or 3 stitches to fasten that shank button on, and do our 1, 2 loops, 3 loops around, which catches all those threads into one just to reinforce those stitches together, and then do a couple of tacking stitches to catch our thread over the same spot. Sometimes you can go back through those looped stitches that you've done, and then in our last final stitch we can go back through the loop, which causes the knot. Pull it tight. There we go. We have our shank button attached. All those stitches hide underneath our button. Beautiful. You can't see from underneath. Looks lovely and neat. So, happy sewing. See you next week for some arm knitting.